My grandfather was a millionaire who didn't trust banks, so he hid everything in Bitcoin. It was brilliant, until Alzheimer's made him forget the passwords, the wallets, the fortune itself. And what happened next tore our family apart in ways we never imagined. Enjoy the story. When I was a kid, my grandfather was larger than life, not just in stature, but in presence. He had this quiet intensity, like a man who always knew something the rest of us didn't. While most grandfathers told stories about war or love, mine talked about market crashes and digital gold. I didn't understand half of what he said back then, but I remember the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about decentralization, privacy, and the future of money. To most of the world, Bitcoin was a joke. To him, it was salvation. He poured everything into it, not just his money, but his legacy. He believed it would protect the family long after he was gone. What none of us could imagine was that the one enemy he couldn't outsmart was inside his own mind. It started with little things, a forgotten appointment, a misplaced key, a question repeated twice in the same conversation. At first, we laughed it off. Old age, we said. Everyone forgets now and then. But deep down, something felt wrong. This was a man who never forgot a number in his life. He could recall the exact price he bought his first share of IBM in the 70s, and now, he was asking me how to use the microwave. I began to notice sticky notes around his house, strange scribbles on envelopes, and folders labeled with random strings of letters and numbers. It was like watching a supercomputer glitch in real time, and it terrified me, because I knew, long before he ever admitted it, that he was losing the very thing he had always depended on, his mind. Then came the day that changed everything. I had just come back from college when he called me into his study. His hands were trembling, his eyes clouded, but there was urgency in his voice. "I need you to help me find something," he said. On the desk was an old leather notebook filled with codes, phrases, and what looked like wallet addresses. "Everything's in here," he whispered, "but I don't remember the order." That sentence hit me like a brick. The man who built a digital fortress around our family's fortune no longer remembered how to unlock it. And suddenly, I wasn't just his grandson. I was the only person who could help him recover everything or lose it all forever. I spent that night sitting on the floor of his study, flipping through the notebook, my laptop open, eyes burning from screen light and stress. Every page was like a puzzle, a breadcrumb trail of numbers, crypto jargon, and strange phrases that could have been passwords or meaningless thoughts. My grandfather sat beside me, silent at first, then occasionally interrupting with fragments. "Try Copenhagen 47. That might be it." Or, was it on the red USB? No, maybe the blue one. It was chaos, and the more I dug, the more I realized how deep his paranoia had run. He hadn't just hidden his Bitcoin, he had scattered it across multiple wallets, each protected with its own two-factor systems, private keys, and passwords. He had built a fortress, and now, with his memory fading, I had to find the doors. Without knowing where the locks were, the pressure grew by the hour. If I couldn't recover the wallet soon, we risked losing everything. But this wasn't just about money. This was about trust. He had trusted me, the youngest in the family, with something the others didn't even know existed. My mother thought he was eccentric. My uncle called him paranoid. Neither of them had any clue about the fortune hidden in digital shadows, and I couldn't tell them. Not yet. If I failed, if I said the wrong thing, they'd think he was delusional. Maybe they'd take control of his estate, put him in a home, strip away everything he had built. So I kept quiet. I kept digging. I became obsessed. Every free hour was spent decoding, guessing, researching, trying to step into the mind of a genius slowly unraveling. One evening, as we sat together in the dim light of his study, he suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Promise me you won't let them touch it," he said, voice shaking. "It's not just money, it's protection, it's independence." I nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of what he meant. This wasn't just a treasure hunt, it was a battle against time, against disease, against a system that saw old men as obsolete. And every time he forgot my name or repeated a story, it felt like another door closing, another piece of the map vanishing. But I refused to give up, because somewhere in that notebook, somewhere in his fading memories, was the legacy of a man who trusted no one except me. The turning point came late one night when I stumbled across a strange combination in the margins of the notebook. July 19th, 67, sunset, first promise, It didn't look like a password. It looked like a memory. I asked him, casually, if that date meant anything to him. His eyes softened. "That was the day I proposed to your grandmother," he said. "We sat on the cliff, watched the sun go down. I told her I'd build something that would outlive us both." That was the first time I saw tears in his eyes, not from confusion, but from clarity. It was like the memory had lit something inside him. That moment became my new clue. I realized his passwords weren't random. They were tied to emotions, to moments, to pieces of his soul. This wasn't a cryptographic riddle. It was a love story written in code. The next few days became a deep dive into his past. I interviewed him like a journalist, carefully weaving memories into questions. Where did you live in 1980? What was your favorite vacation? What did grandma call you when she was mad? He would laugh, sometimes go quiet, and then offer fragments. I cross-referenced every answer with the codes in the notebook. Sometimes they matched, sometimes they didn't. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. I discovered that each wallet was named after a chapter in his life. One was titled Freedom 1972, another, Last Cigarette. There was even one called Her Laugh. These weren't just investments, they were memoirs, each encrypted. With the weight of a memory he no longer fully owned, I began unlocking them one at a time. Small amounts at first, then a balance that made my heart stop. It was over $1.4 million, sitting there untouched for nearly a decade. The wallet had been hidden behind layers of decoys, firewalls, and a 24-word seed phrase crafted from the lyrics of his favorite song. I stared at the screen in disbelief, then looked at him. He was dozing off in his chair, blanket pulled to his chest, a slight smile on his face. I didn't wake him. I just sat there, realizing what had just happened. I had opened the first door, but there were more, many more, and I knew that I had to keep going, not just for the money, but for him, for the man who had buried pieces of himself in a digital vault, praying someone would one day understand the language of his legacy before it vanished forever. The morning after unlocking that first wallet, everything felt different. I wasn't just decoding phrases, I was piecing together a life. Every new clue gave me a deeper understanding of the man I thought I knew. It was like archaeology of the soul, brushing off layers of digital dust to reveal the emotion beneath. But there was no time to celebrate. His memory was slipping faster now. He'd wake up and forget what year it was, ask if his wife was still alive, or mistake me for his brother. And still, every once in a while, he'd snap back just long enough to offer a fragment, a place, a name, a strange word that made no sense until I linked it to something hidden in that notebook. It was a race. Each day, the clock ticked louder. The pressure was brutal. I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing, not yet. My mother was beginning to notice how much time I spent at Grandpa's place. She assumed I was just being helpful, spending time with him while he declined. But she didn't see the war being waged behind the study door. She didn't see the dozens of browser tabs, the spreadsheets, the recovery tools, or the handwritten notes I taped to the walls. She didn't see how I cried in the car after failing to unlock a wallet because I couldn't figure out whether Ruby referred to a dog, a stone, or an old flame. The closer I got, the heavier it became. This wasn't just about restoring access to a digital fortune. It was about honoring a man who had spent his life preparing for something he could know. Longer finished, then came the question that froze me. One evening, during a rare lucid moment, he looked straight at me and asked, "What happens if I forget you?" I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to lie, to tell him that would never happen. But the truth was, it already had. Once or twice he had called me boy or kid, or even Jeremy, his brother's name. It shattered me. But I just smiled and said, "Then I'll remind you." He nodded and closed his eyes. That night, I worked harder than ever. I stayed up until sunrise and found another wallet, this one called Stone. It was locked behind a phrase only he would remember. So I woke him gently and asked, "What was the street name of your first house?" His lips trembled. Then, with clarity, he whispered, "Elmwood." The wallet opened, and behind it was over $2 million. $2 million. That number echoed in my chest like a drumbeat, not because of the money itself, but because it meant I was still reaching him. Even through the fog of Alzheimer's, some part of him was still in there, holding on. Elmwood. That single word unlocked more than a wallet. It gave me hope. Hope that he hadn't completely slipped away. Hope that this wasn't just a one-way road into forgetting. I showed him the screen. He blinked, confused at first, but then his face softened. "You did it?" he asked. I nodded. For a moment, he looked proud. Then, almost instantly, it faded. He asked me what we were doing again. I smiled, held his hand, and said, "Just spending time together." Because sometimes, the truth would only break him further, and I couldn't let that happen. Not now. From that point on, I created a system. I categorized the notebooks, the USB drives, the notes, and printed screenshots of every successful recovery. I backed up everything twice, once offline, once in encrypted cloud storage in case something happened to me. It had become more than a mission. It was a duty. I was no longer just a grandson. I was his archivist, his digital executor, and in many ways, his memory. But it wasn't always victories. There were days I hit dead ends, wallets with partial phrases, corrupted files, or missing hardware keys. Once, I spent an entire weekend trying to open a wallet called Last Dance, only to realize it was stored on an old laptop that no longer turned on. I nearly threw it across the room, until I found a sticky note inside the case with a clue. It's buried with the photo album. I raced to the basement where his old boxes were stacked like forgotten tombstones. After digging for hours, I found a dusty photo album wrapped in plastic. Inside it, taped to the back cover, was a flash drive. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop. There it was, Last Dance, a wallet untouched since 2015. The passphrase, a lyric from the song he danced to with Grandma at their anniversary. "Save the last dance for me." I typed it in, heart pounding. It worked. Another $800,000. I wanted to scream, cry, call someone. But instead, I walked upstairs, sat beside him as he stared at the rain through the window, and said, "I found the one with Grandma's song." He smiled faintly. She loved that song. And just like that, another piece of him returned, if only for a moment. The house began to feel like a living memory. Every drawer, every photograph, every corner of the attic held potential, not just for recovery, but for reconnection. I became obsessed with scanning each room as if it were a map, not of a house, but of a man. I realized that my grandfather had hidden parts of his fortune, not out of fear, but out of purpose. Each wallet was tucked away with intention. Some behind old receipts, some disguised as harmless documents, and others hidden in code embedded within scanned documents or voice recordings, labeled with strange titles like Rainy Tuesday or March 4th Smile. I learned to think like him. Not the man he was now, but the man he used to be, the one who prepared for every possibility, including losing himself. And in doing so, I felt like I was meeting him all over again. One day, while organizing old audio tapes in a box labeled "Do Not Erase," I found a cassette. Written in fading marker was, "For when I forget." I borrowed an old tape player from a neighbor and listened. His voice crackled through the speaker, steady, calm, and deeply personal. "If you're hearing this, it means I've forgotten. Maybe your name, maybe your face. But I remember the feeling of holding your hand when you were born, of teaching you to ride a bike, of hearing you laugh when I messed up the pancakes." I broke down crying. It was like hearing a ghost, not from the past, but from a man trapped inside the present. "There's a final wallet," he continued. "The biggest one. I called it Legacy. You'll know where it is. You've always known." And then, the tape ended. I was numb. That was the first time I realized there was one final puzzle left, one that he had built, not for himself, but for me, not for recovery, but for meaning. Legacy wasn't just about wealth, it was about understanding. I thought about everything he had taught me, the way he had quietly shaped me over the years. It wasn't just about passwords and crypto, it was about courage, independence, and being the kind of person who could carry weight, even when it crushed you. I didn't know where legacy was yet. But I knew the answer wasn't in the notebook. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere only I could reach, not because I was smart, but because I was his. The next morning, I woke up early, made him breakfast, and told him, "We're going on one last treasure hunt." He smiled, even if he didn't remember why. We started with the attic, dusty, chaotic, full of old trunks and broken furniture. It hadn't been touched in years. He followed me up the creaky stairs, a little confused, but cooperative. I opened boxes of photographs, journals, even childhood toys from when my mother was a girl. Each item brought a flicker of something to his eyes, a momentary flash of recognition, but nothing stood out. Then I saw an old globe tucked behind a pile of faded paintings. I rolled it forward and noticed it was hollow. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a small metal box. My heart raced. I handed it to him, but he looked at me and said, "Is this yours?" That sentence broke me a little, but I smiled, nodded, and said, "It's ours." Inside the box was a USB drive. No label, no clue, just silence. I knew I had found something. I took the drive downstairs, plugged it in, and held my breath. One folder, password protected, no name. I stared at the screen and whispered, "Legacy." It rejected the input. I tried variations, nothing. Then I remembered the tape, "You've always known." I closed my eyes and thought, what did I always associate with him? Not money, not Bitcoin, but something deeper. Then it hit me. When I was a child, every time we'd say goodbye, he'd whisper the same words, "You are my greatest investment." I typed it in, slowly, carefully, and the folder opened. My hands trembled as the files loaded. Inside were documents, keys, backups, and a final wallet address, the balance. Over $5 million. I turned to him, but he was staring out the window, humming a tune. He had no idea what had just happened. Or maybe he did. I sat beside him and showed him the screen. "I found Legacy," I whispered. He looked, confused, then squinted. "Is that a lot?" I laughed through the tears. "Yeah, Grandpa, it's a lot." He smiled and nodded. Then we did good. I wanted to freeze that moment, bottle it up, because I knew it wouldn't last. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me and said, "You're a good boy, Jeremy." My name's not Jeremy, but I held his hand anyway and said, "Thanks, Grandpa," because in that moment, it didn't matter. The man who had spent a lifetime building a legacy had passed the torch, not just of wealth, but of love, grit, and silent sacrifice. And no disease could ever take that away from me. In the weeks that followed, I began the process of securing everything he had built. I transferred the assets into trust wallets, created legal documents, and set up an encrypted backup that only I could access with a biometric key. But while the digital part was coming together, the emotional weight was beginning to settle in. Every file I opened, every transaction I traced, reminded me that none of this would have happened without his mind, the very thing that was now crumbling before my eyes. I would sit with him at lunch, watching him forget how to use a fork, all while knowing he had once engineered a system of wealth more complex than most banks. It felt cruel, like the universe had allowed him to win the game of life, and then snatched the memory of that victory away before he could enjoy it. I tried to keep our routine normal, morning walks, crossword puzzles, even though he couldn't finish them. He liked pretending. He'd ask about my day, then forget my answer within minutes, but sometimes he'd have these clear windows where he'd say something startlingly accurate. "Don't let them divide over this," he said once. "Money makes good people greedy." I promised him I'd protect the family, even if they never knew what I did, because part of me feared what would happen if they did. My uncle had always resented Grandpa's independence, and my mother, though well-meaning, didn't understand the magnitude of what had been left behind. They would fight, they would question, they would want their share, and none of them would see it for what it really was. A story told in code, a lifetime encrypted, and passed only to the one person who took the time to listen. The hardest part came when he stopped recognizing the house. He'd wander through the hallway at night, whispering, "Where is she?" or "I need to go home." I'd walk him back to bed, remind him who I was, and sit beside him until he drifted off. The house, once filled with secrets, now echoed with confusion. And yet, through it all, I felt more connected to him than ever, because I knew what no one else did. Not just where the money was, but why he had hidden it. He wasn't hoarding wealth. He was preserving dignity, building a way for his family to survive a future he knew he wouldn't be part of. It wasn't about control, it was about care. And now, that responsibility was mine, heavy, sacred, and irreversible. I kept everything hidden, not because I wanted to deceive my family, but because I knew they weren't ready to understand. If they saw the numbers, they'd see dollar signs, but I saw something else, time capsules. Each wallet was a story, a moment in his life when he believed in something greater than himself. Freedom 1972 wasn't just a password. It was the year he walked away from a job that nearly killed him. Her laugh was a sound he once said he'd give his fortune to hear again. And legacy, that wasn't for him. That was his final letter to me. written in a language only I had been willing to learn. To them, it would be just money, but to me, it was the roadmap to everything he'd ever loved, feared, and fought for. And that kind of wealth, you don't split in a court dot. Eventually, questions started coming. My mother noticed his financial documents were disorganized, or rather, missing entirely. "Did he ever tell you where he kept the retirement accounts?" she asked one day. I lied, said I had no idea. I hated it. But the truth would open doors that couldn't be closed. If they knew what was buried in those digital vaults, there would be lawyers, accountants, accusations. They'd say he was mentally unfit when he made those decisions. They'd challenge everything, and they wouldn't understand that he wanted it this way. That the man who had outwitted Wall Street in the 80s and went all in on Bitcoin before it even hit $100 wasn't out of his mind. He was years ahead of it. So I stayed quiet, because protecting a legacy sometimes means protecting it from the ones you love. But there was one more thing I had to do, something he couldn't. He had built the system. I had restored it. Now, I had to preserve it. So, I began writing it all down. Not just the keys or the codes, but the why behind each choice. I created a private video journal, recording everything he told me, every breakthrough, every wallet name, and what it meant. I wasn't just archiving data, I was documenting a life that deserved to be remembered in full. One day, maybe I'll share it with the rest of the family. Maybe I won't. But when I looked at him, sitting in the sunroom, watching birds, he no longer remembered the names of. I knew I had already fulfilled the most important part of the mission. I had made sure he wouldn't be forgotten, even if he forgot everything else. The decline came faster than I expected. It was like watching sand slip through a crack, slowly at first, then all at once. He stopped asking questions, stopped recognizing his own handwriting, stopped fighting the fog. Some days, he would just sit and hum songs no one else remembered, lost in a place I couldn't reach. But I still visited. I still held his hand. I still read aloud from the notebook, not because he could follow, but because it felt like a tether, one final connection to the man who had once built digital castles out of thin air. I kept hoping something would spark inside him, that a phrase or name would unlock something. But the truth was undeniable. The man who hid a fortune in the most complex system imaginable was slowly vanishing into silence. Then, one afternoon, something happened. I was showing him an old video, a home movie from when I was 6. In it, he was teaching me how to swim. He was laughing, confident, alive. Beside me, in real time, he sat motionless. But then, just as the video ended, he whispered, "That was a good day." My heart stopped. It was the first clear sentence he had said in weeks. I turned to him, eyes wide, and asked, "Do you remember that?" He smiled faintly. "Not all of it, but I remember the feeling." That line stayed with me. It reminded me that even when memories fade, the emotions stay. The love stays. The intention behind the legacy doesn't need a password. It's written in how he raised me, how he protected us, how he trusted me when he couldn't trust his own mind. That night, I opened the final backup folder he had labeled just in case. Inside, there was no money, no key, no code, just a letter, typed in a large font, barely aligned on the screen. It read, "If I forget everything, I hope I remember love. If I forget who I am, I hope you remember who I tried to be." I stared at those words for a long time, unsure whether to cry or smile. It was the clearest message he had ever left me. Not about wealth, not about planning, but about identity, about what we leave behind when our minds no longer follow. He had hidden millions in Bitcoin, but the real treasure was the faith he had in me to carry what he couldn't, and that treasure was already safe. After reading that final letter, something inside me shifted. I stopped obsessing over the balances, the backups, the cold wallets. They were secure. I had done my part. But now, the mission wasn't about recovery, it was about preservation. My grandfather didn't just want to pass down money. He wanted to pass down memory, meaning, and a map to navigate life when logic fails. So I turned our story into something tangible. I wrote a book, not for the world, not for fame, but for the family. I called it The Architect of Silence. Each chapter was a piece of him, the Bitcoin years, the early retirement, the love story with grandma, and yes, even the forgetting. I printed one copy, leather-bound, simple. I placed it in his study, on the same shelf where the notebook had once lived, and I told no one. Life outside the house moved on. People asked less and less about him. He had become part of the background, the old man in the chair, the one who sometimes smiled, sometimes stared. But I kept visiting, kept talking to him, kept reading to him, even if he didn't respond. Because I wasn't reading for him anymore, I was reading for the boy who once learned what real strength looked like. A man who chose foresight over comfort, who prepared for a future he wouldn't benefit from, who stored not just his fortune, but his values in places only love could find. The world saw a man with Alzheimer's. I saw a master strategist who had already won the war, long before the disease could take the field. And no diagnosis could erase that truth. Then, one evening, I found him asleep with the notebook on his lap. He hadn't picked it up in months. Somehow, he had wandered into the study, opened it, and just held it, as if some part of him remembered what it meant. I sat beside him, placed my hand on his, and whispered, "It's all safe, Grandpa." Everything. He stirred, looked at me, and said one word I'll never forget. Proud. That was it, just that, but it was everything. It was the final key, not to a wallet, but to a chapter. And as I sat there with him, knowing the end was near, I finally felt peace. Because I had decoded more than a fortune. I had decoded a man. And what I found was more valuable than anything stored on any blockchain. The days that followed felt slower, quieter, like the final pages of a book you're afraid to finish. My grandfather no longer spoke in full sentences. He spent most of his time gazing out the window, eyes following things only he could see. But I stayed by his side, not out of duty, but because I didn't want to miss even a second of what remained. Sometimes, he would murmur words that made no sense. Other times, he would squeeze my hand for no reason at all, but I liked to believe it meant he knew I was still there. The world outside didn't notice the shift, but I did. I felt the weight of each moment, as if time had thickened, making every minute stretch a little longer, and a little heavier. One night, the nurse called me at 3 a.m. "He's asking for you," she said. I rushed to his room, heart racing. When I arrived, he was awake, eyes wide open, more alert than I'd seen him in weeks. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Did we do it?" I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. I sat down, took his hand, and said, "Yeah, Grandpa, we did it. Everything's safe." He nodded once, then closed his eyes. He didn't speak again after that. But something about that final exchange felt like closure, not just for him, but for me. As if he'd been holding on for that confirmation, that reassurance that all his work, all his sacrifice, all his buried brilliance hadn't been for nothing, that it would live on through me. He passed away 3 days later, peacefully, quietly, with the sun rising just outside his window. I didn't cry at first. I just sat there, holding his hand, feeling the warmth fade. The world would never know what he had done. There would be no headlines, no articles about the man who hid millions in Bitcoin while battling a disease that stole his name. But I knew, and that was enough. At his funeral, I gave a eulogy without mentioning money, code, or technology. I talked about the man who taught me resilience, the man who played chess without saying a word, the man who whispered, "You are my greatest investment," every time we parted ways. And in the silence that followed, I could almost hear him whisper it one last time. In the weeks after the funeral, I returned to the house, not as a caretaker, but as its last true witness. Every room felt different. The silence was heavier now, not the confused quiet of illness, but the final stillness of a story that had reached its last page. I walked through the study, brushing my hand along the bookshelf, now holding not just his notebooks, but the architect of silence. I opened the window, letting in air that smelled of morning grass and unfinished conversations. And then I sat in his chair, the same one where he once whispered passwords to me between sips of tea and half-finished memories. The notebook was still there, beside the armrest. I opened it to the first page. If you're reading this, it means you didn't give up. I hadn't, and I never would. It took me months to finalize everything. The legal transfers, the trust accounts, the silent disbursement of funds to family members without ever revealing the full truth. I kept it quiet, just like he would have wanted. I created anonymous donations in his name to causes he believed in, paid off my mother's mortgage without explanation, set up college funds for his great-grandchildren who hadn't even been born yet, all of it hidden beneath layers of security, not to conceal greed, but to protect the dignity of his legacy. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just following the blueprint he left me, a blueprint built on caution, compassion, and an unwavering belief that love doesn't always speak. Sometimes, it encrypts itself in silence. Every now and then, I'd get emails from crypto exchanges, reminding me that wallet activity had occurred. I'd smile, knowing that part of him was still moving in the world, invisible yet powerful. It reminded me of his words, "Real strength isn't loud. It's what survives in silence." I never cashed out everything. Some of it, I left untouched, like a digital monument, proof that he existed, that he planned, that he believed in the future, even when the present betrayed him. And when people ask me why I never talk about my inheritance, I simply say, because it wasn't about the money. And if they press me further, I smile and reply, the fortune wasn't what he left me, it was who he helped me become. Years have passed since then, but his presence never left. Sometimes, I still hear his voice when I'm deep in thought, that calm, deliberate tone explaining how trust was more valuable than gold, and foresight stronger than luck. I see his influence in every decision I make, especially the quiet ones, the ones no one praises, but that shape everything. I built a life around the lessons hidden in his silence. I started a foundation in his name, anonymous, like he would have wanted to help families battling Alzheimer's navigate the storm we barely survived. It wasn't a public gesture. It wasn't for recognition. It was the final phase of his design, letting his legacy serve others without demanding anything. In return, that was who he was, a quiet protector, a silent architect of something bigger than himself. I still visit the house. It's mine now, though I've kept it exactly as he left it. The study remains untouched, and the photo album sits on the coffee table, opened to the picture of him and Grandma dancing in the kitchen. Sometimes I play the old tape again, the one where he says, "If I forget everything, I hope I remember love." I listen to it not just for comfort, but as a compass, a reminder that even brilliance fades, even fortunes vanish, but intention, that stays. That tape wasn't just a message to a grandson, it was a declaration to time itself. You may erase my mind, but you'll never erase my love. And that love, it didn't need to be spoken. It was encoded into every step he took, every safeguard he built, every whisper he left behind. The world will never know his name. There will be no documentaries or biographies, no headlines about a man who quietly preserved a digital empire while his mind slowly unraveled. But in my world, he's a giant, a myth, a code no disease could ever crack. And every time I hear someone talk about crypto, legacy, or memory, I smile because they're talking about him, without even knowing it. The man who hid millions in Bitcoin not to impress, but to protect, not to control, but to prepare. And when they ask me how he did it, I tell them the truth. He didn't just leave me money, he left me instructions. He didn't just raise me, he programmed me. And the code he wrote wasn't in blockchain, it was in love. There's one final detail I've never shared with anyone, not even in the book I wrote. It was something I discovered months after his passing, buried deep in the metadata of one of the backup drives he had created, a file hidden in plain sight, titled simply, "Goodbye." It wasn't a will or a technical document, it was a voice recording. In it, his tone was fragile but focused, like a man aware that this might be the last time he'd ever speak without confusion. "If you've made it here," he said, "then you already know everything that matters. The rest, let it go. Don't waste your life explaining what they'll never understand. Protect the ones you love. Disappear when it's time. And remember, real wealth is what they can't take from you." Then, silence. A final, deliberate, click, end of file. I sat in front of the screen for a long time after that, staring at the timestamp. It had been recorded months before his diagnosis, before the forgetting began. He had known, somehow, he had seen it coming and set the wheels in motion. Not to be saved, but to save someone else. Me. That's the kind of man he was. Not loud, not flashy, but relentless in his love, strategic in his sacrifice. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully grasped until then. His greatest creation wasn't the Bitcoin system he built. It was me, the person he formed, encrypted with patience, trained in silence, and prepared not just to inherit a fortune, but to carry a legacy that words alone could never explain. So if you're listening to this story now, wondering why any of it matters, it's because someday you'll be someone's legacy too. You'll either leave behind clutter or clarity, noise or purpose. You may not have millions in crypto, or encrypted notebooks, or voice recordings on dusty tapes, but you do have something just as powerful: your intention, how you love, how you plan, how you protect people who may never know what you've done for them. My grandfather taught me that, and now I carry his blueprint forward, not just in memory, but in motion. And whenever I get lost, whenever I doubt what comes next, I open the last page of his notebook, the one where he scribbled, almost childlike, in fading ink, "If he remembers me, I'll never truly be gone."